You worthless thing! Aren't you ashamed of yourself?
The day my husband called me worthless, he had no idea I was already gone. I remember the exact moment I stopped loving my husband. It wasn't when I found the hotel receipts. It wasn't when his mother told me I would never be good enough for their family. It wasn't even when he served me divorce papers on our anniversary. It was much quieter than that, much sadder. I was standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes in the tiny apartment we shared, and he walked past me like I was furniture. Not a person, not his wife, just something in his way. That's when the love died, not with a fight or tears, just silence, just the feeling of becoming invisible in your own life. My name is Betty, and for 11 years I believed I was nothing. My husband Paul told me I was lucky he married me. His family reminded me constantly that I came from nowhere, that my parents were simple people, that I should be grateful a man from a good family had chosen me. I believed them. When you hear something enough times, it becomes true in your head even when your heart knows better. I cooked and cleaned and worked 2 jobs and smiled and apologized for existing. I made myself smaller and smaller trying to fit into the space they gave me, and it still wasn't enough. The affair went on for 2 years before I found out. 2 years of Paul telling me he was working late, that the firm needed him, that he was trying to build our future. I would wait up for him with dinner getting cold on the table, wondering what I had done wrong, why he seemed so distant. His mother would call and tell me I wasn't supporting him enough, that a good wife would understand that important men have important work. So I tried harder. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital where I worked as a cleaner. I used that money to buy him nice shirts, to make sure he always looked successful, to prove I was worth keeping. Then I saw them together at a restaurant. I had finished my shift and was walking home to save bus fare when I passed the window, and there they were. Paul and a woman I didn't know, holding hands across the table, looking at each other the way he used to look at me a lifetime ago. I stood on that sidewalk watching them for 10 minutes. People walked around me. Cars passed. The world kept moving while mine completely stopped. I waited for anger to come, for rage, for the desire to storm in there and make a scene. But all I felt was tired. So deeply, impossibly tired. Hey, before I continue, can you do me something? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Are you watching this at work, on your phone, in bed, during your commute? I want to know I'm not alone in telling this story, and you're not alone in hearing it. And if you're feeling something right now, if this is touching something in you, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel, because I promise you, what happens next will change how you see everything. Share this with someone who needs to remember their worth. Now let me tell you what happened when I finally found my voice. I didn't confront Paul that night. I went home and I sat in the dark and I thought about my life. I thought about the girl I used to be before I got married, the one who loved painting and dreamed of opening a small art studio someday. I thought about how I had given up art school to marry Paul because his mother said wives didn't need careers. They needed to support their husbands' careers. I thought about all the times I had apologized for things that weren't my fault. All the times I had swallowed my words to keep peace. All the versions of myself I had killed trying to be what they wanted. The divorce was brutal. Paul's family had money and lawyers, and they used both to destroy me. They said I was unstable, that I was trying to take advantage of Paul, that I had always been after his money even though I had worked 2 jobs our entire marriage while he was still finding himself. His mother actually testified that I was a bad wife, that I had driven Paul away with my neediness. I sat in that courtroom and listened to them rewrite our entire marriage, turn me into a villain in a story where I had only ever tried to love someone who couldn't love me back. I got almost nothing in the divorce. Paul's lawyer argued that since I had no children and no real contributions to the marriage, I deserved no support. The judge agreed. I walked out of that courthouse with my clothes, my grandmother's old jewelry box, and a heart that felt like broken glass. Paul married the other woman 3 months later. His mother posted pictures from the wedding on social media, pictures of Paul looking happy in a way I had never been able to make him look. I stared at those photos for hours, wondering what was wrong with me, why I hadn't been enough. I moved back to my grandmother's village, to the small house where I grew up. My parents had died in a bus accident when I was 7, and my grandmother had raised me alone. She had passed 2 years before, and the house had been sitting empty. It was tiny, just 3 rooms with concrete floors and walls that needed paint. The roof leaked when it rained hard, but it was mine. Nobody there to tell me I was worthless. Nobody to make me feel small. Just me and the silence, and the weight of starting over at 33 with nothing. I got a job at the local school, helping in the kitchen, serving lunch to children who looked at me with open, honest faces. They didn't know I was divorced, or that I had failed at marriage, or that I came from nowhere. They just knew I gave them extra rice when they were still hungry, and that I learned all their names. Those children saved me in ways they'll never understand. Their laughter reminded me that joy still existed. Their simple kindness reminded me that not everyone in the world was cruel. 6 months after I moved back, a letter came. Thick envelope, official looking, from a law firm in the capital city I had never heard of. My hands shook opening it because I thought it was Paul, thought maybe he was suing me for something else, finding new ways to punish me for the crime of having married him. But it wasn't from Paul. It was about my grandmother's estate. I almost laughed. My grandmother had been a seamstress her whole life. What estate could she possibly have had? The lawyer's office was 3 hours away by bus. I used money I needed for food to make the trip, arriving dusty and tired in my only decent dress. The lawyer was a kind woman named Grace, who looked at me with gentle eyes and asked me to sit down. She told me my grandmother had left instructions that I was to learn about my inheritance on my 26th birthday, but since she had died before that day came, the lawyers had waited until I turned 27 to honor her wishes as closely as possible. Then Grace slid papers across the desk, and my whole world tilted sideways. My grandmother owned land. Not just the small plot where her house stood, but hundreds of acres in the northern region that had been passed down through her family for generations. Land that nobody thought was worth anything because it was dry and remote and forgotten. Except 5 years ago, a mining company had discovered rare minerals under that land. My grandmother had negotiated carefully, had sold some parcels and leased others, had invested the money with Grace's firm. The numbers on the paper didn't make sense to me at first. Too many zeros. It had to be a mistake. Grace told me gently, like she was afraid I might break, that my grandmother's estate was worth $230 million, that most of it was in investments and trust funds set up for my future and my children's future, but that $25 million was available to me now, to live on, to build the life my grandmother had wanted for me. I sat in that office and I couldn't breathe. I kept reading the numbers over and over, waiting for them to change, waiting to wake up from a dream. Grace gave me water and tissues and time to process what felt impossible. There was a letter, too, in my grandmother's handwriting. I recognized it immediately, the shaky letters from hands that had sewn thousands of garments over a lifetime. She had written it knowing she might not live to see me read it, knowing these might be her final words to me. My hands trembled so hard Grace had to help me hold the pages steady. My dear Betty, my grandmother had written, if you are reading this, I am gone and you are learning about the inheritance I worked so hard to keep secret. I lived simply not because I had to, but because I chose to. I wanted you to grow up knowing the value of hard work, the importance of kindness, the strength that comes from having nothing except your character. I wanted you to be ready for wealth, not ruined by it. Money can make you big or small depending on who you are inside. I raised you to be big, to be strong, to be good. Use this inheritance wisely. Help people who cannot help themselves. Remember where you came from. And my dear girl, never let anyone make you feel worthless again. You come from women who survived everything and still loved fiercely. That is your real inheritance. I sobbed in that office until I had no tears left. Grace sat with me quietly, not rushing me, understanding somehow that I wasn't just crying about the money. I was crying for my grandmother who had protected me even from beyond death. I was crying for the years I had spent believing I was nothing. I was crying for the girl who had given up her dreams to marry a man who never deserved her. I was crying because suddenly I had choices, had freedom, had a future that belonged to me. I didn't tell anyone about the money. Not the neighbors in the village who had been kind to me. Not my few remaining friends from before the marriage who had drifted away during the divorce. Not the teachers at the school where I worked. I kept going to my job every day, kept living in my grandmother's small house, kept dressing in simple clothes from the market. I needed time to think, to figure out who I was now, to understand this strange new reality. Paul sent me a message 2 months later. Just a text, casual and cruel in its thoughtlessness. He was having a celebration party for his promotion at his father's law firm, and I was invited. Not because he wanted me there, the message made clear, but because it would look good to have his ex-wife show up and prove there were no hard feelings. His mother had suggested it apparently. A show of maturity and moving forward. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling the old familiar urge to make myself smaller, to accommodate, to please. Then I thought about my grandmother's letter, about never letting anyone make me feel worthless again, and I wrote back that I would come, not for Paul, not for his mother, but for myself, to prove I could stand in a room with people who had tried to break me and not shatter, to show them I had survived. I didn't tell them about the money. That wasn't the point. The point was simply showing up as myself, complete and whole, not needing their approval or validation. The party was at an expensive hotel ballroom downtown. I took the bus there, wearing the same dress I had worn to the divorce hearing because it was still my only good dress, and because there was something powerful about that choice. When I walked into that ballroom, I saw Paul immediately. He looked older somehow, tired around the eyes despite his expensive suit and his beautiful wife beside him. He saw me and something flickered across his face. Surprise maybe that I had actually come, or discomfort at having to face me. His mother descended on me within minutes, her smile sharp and false. She told me how good it was that I could be mature about everything, how happy Paul was now with a woman who understood how to be a proper wife, how I should really consider finding someone more suitable to my background and station. Every word was designed to cut, to remind me of my place, to make sure I knew I was only tolerated, not welcomed. I smiled and said nothing, letting her words bounce off me like rain off stone. The evening dragged on with speeches and toasts and people congratulating Paul on his success. I sat at a table in the back, largely ignored, watching this performance of his perfect life. I should have left, should have realized that coming had been a mistake, that these people would never see me as anything other than the failure who wasn't good enough. But something made me stay. Maybe stubbornness, maybe destiny, maybe my grandmother's spirit telling me to wait, to be patient, to trust. Then Paul stood up to give a speech. He thanked his father and his colleagues and his beautiful new wife. He talked about leaving the past behind and embracing the future. And then, with the microphone in his hand and everyone listening, he pointed at me. Actually pointed across the room like I was an object on display. He said he wanted to acknowledge his ex-wife for coming tonight, for showing grace and accepting that she just wasn't cut out for the life he needed. He said he hoped I would find happiness with someone more on my level. He said this to a room full of people who laughed politely, uncomfortably, not sure if this was appropriate but not willing to challenge him. I felt that old familiar feeling of being small, being nothing, being invisible. And then I felt something else. Anger, clean and pure and righteous. Not the hot rage that makes you scream and break things. The cold anger that makes you clear and focused and strong. I stood up slowly and the room went quiet. I didn't plan what happened next. Didn't rehearse it. I just walked toward the front of the room, toward Paul who was watching me with confusion and growing alarm. I took the microphone from his hand, just reached out and took it, and he was so surprised he let me. I stood there in front of all those people in my old dress with my simple life and my supposedly low station, and I spoke clearly, my voice not shaking at all. I said that Paul was right about one thing. I had been cut out for a different kind of life. Not smaller, not less, just different, better. I said I had spent 11 years trying to be enough for people who would never value me, because they didn't value anyone except themselves. I said I forgave him, not because he asked for it or deserved it, but because I deserved to be free of the anger. I said I forgave his mother for her cruelty because carrying hatred for her was only hurting me. I said I forgave all of them for teaching me the hard way that my worth didn't come from their acceptance. And then I thanked them, actually thanked them, because divorcing me had been the greatest gift Paul ever gave me. It had forced me to find myself again, to remember who I was before I tried to become what they wanted. It had sent me back to my grandmother's house where I learned about my inheritance, not just the money but the legacy of strength. The room was completely silent. You could hear people breathing. Paul's face had gone white. His mother was staring at me like I had lost my mind. And I felt power flowing through me, not the power of money but the power of truth, of finally speaking after years of silence. I handed the microphone back to Paul and walked toward the exit. People moved out of my way like I was someone important, someone to be respected, seeing me clearly for maybe the first time. I heard footsteps behind me as I reached the door. It was Paul's wife, the woman he had left me for. She caught my arm gently and her eyes were full of tears. She whispered that she was sorry, that she hadn't known, that Paul had told her I was cold and distant and had made his life miserable. She said watching me just now had shown her something she needed to see, that she was starting to feel invisible too, that the way Paul's mother treated her was starting to sound familiar. That maybe she had made a terrible mistake. I told her gently that her journey was her own, that she would figure out what she needed to do, and then I left. I rode the bus home to my grandmother's village with my heart lighter than it had been in years. I had faced them and I hadn't broken. I had spoken my truth and I had walked away free. The money sitting in accounts I barely touched suddenly felt less important than the wealth I had just reclaimed, the treasure of knowing my own value, of refusing to be diminished. That night I sat at my grandmother's old table and I cried, but these were different tears. Healing tears. Grateful tears. Tears that washed away the last traces of the woman who had believed she was nothing. 3 days later, another letter came. This one was from a children's charity that my grandmother had apparently supported for years. Small donations sent faithfully every month from an account I hadn't known existed. They were building a new hospital wing for children in remote areas who had no access to medical care. They were struggling to raise the final funds needed. The letter asked if I might consider continuing my grandmother's small monthly donation to honor her memory. I sat with that letter for a long time, thinking about my grandmother's instructions to help people who couldn't help themselves, thinking about the children at the school where I worked who had so little but gave so much joy, thinking about what it meant to have money that could actually change lives, save lives. I called Grace the lawyer and told her I wanted to make a donation. She asked how much I was thinking. I told her all of it, everything except what I needed to live simply and comfortably. $200 million to build hospitals and clinics and provide health care for children who were dying of preventable diseases because they were born in the wrong place. Grace argued with me gently, said I should keep more, that I deserved to live well, that I could invest and grow the money and still have plenty to donate. But I was firm. My grandmother had lived simply with millions in the bank. She had understood something important, that having more than you need while others have nothing at all is its own kind of poverty. That real wealth is measured in lives changed, in difference made, in love given. I wanted to live like my grandmother had lived. Modestly and with purpose, rich in the ways that actually matter. The donation was finalized within a month. The charity held a press conference to announce it, the largest gift they had ever received. They insisted I attend, wanted to thank me publicly, to celebrate what this would mean for thousands of children. I almost said no, wanted to stay invisible to keep my grandmother's legacy of quiet generosity. But then I thought about Paul pointing at me in that ballroom, calling me less than, and I realized visibility had its own power, not for revenge, but for truth. The press conference was held at the site where the first new hospital would be built, in a rural area 4 hours from the city. Journalists came and cameras flashed, and the charity's director spoke with tears running down his face about what this meant, how many lives would be saved, how generations of children would benefit. Then they asked me to speak. I stood in front of those microphones in my simple dress with my inherited wealth and my hard-won peace, and I told them about my grandmother. I said she had been a seamstress who lived in a tiny house and wore the same dresses for years. I said she had accumulated her wealth quietly and used it to raise a granddaughter who had learned from her that character mattered more than comfort, that generosity mattered more than possession, that love mattered most of all. I said I was honoring her by giving this money to children who needed it more than I did. I said the real gift my grandmother had given me wasn't money. It was the example of how to live with dignity and purpose, regardless of what you had. That was the inheritance I hoped to pass forward. The story went viral, not just locally but nationally. Major news outlets picked it up, this tale of the seamstress's granddaughter who gave away a fortune. My phone started ringing constantly with interview requests, people wanting to know more, to understand why someone would give away generational wealth. I ignored most of them, overwhelmed by the attention, wanting to return to my quiet life. But the story had its own momentum now, spreading beyond my control. Paul saw it. Of course he saw it. Everyone saw it. 3 days after the press conference, he showed up at my grandmother's house. I was in the garden planting vegetables when I heard his car pull up, an expensive sound that didn't belong in the village. He got out looking uncomfortable in his business suit, out of place among the chickens and dust. I kept planting, my hands in the dirt, not giving him the satisfaction of stopping my work for his arrival. He said my name and his voice was different, smaller somehow. He said he had seen the news and he didn't know what to say. He said he had made a mistake, that leaving me had been the biggest error of his life, that if he had known about the money he never would have divorced me. I finally looked up at him then, this man I had loved so desperately, had tried so hard to please, and I felt nothing. No love, no hate, just a distant sort of pity for someone so lost he could only see value in dollars. I told him the money didn't matter, that even if my grandmother had left me nothing, even if I had stayed poor my whole life, I still would have been worth more than how he treated me. I told him I didn't want him back, didn't need his apology, didn't require anything from him at all. I told him I forgave him months ago, and that forgiveness meant I released him completely, cut the cord that had bound us, freed us both to live separate lives. I told him to go home to his wife and try to treat her better than he treated me, to learn from his mistakes while he still had time. He stood there for a long moment looking at me kneeling in the dirt in my work clothes with soil under my fingernails, looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time and realizing what he had lost. Not the money, me. The woman who had loved him unconditionally, who had worked 2 jobs to support his dreams, who had made herself small so he could feel big. That woman was gone and we both knew it. He left without another word, his expensive car rumbling away down the village road, leaving dust in the air that settled slowly. Life continued in rhythms that felt both new and ancient. I kept my job at the school because the children needed me and I needed them. I lived in my grandmother's house and slowly fixed the roof and painted the walls and planted flowers in the garden. I visited the hospital construction sites and held bobbies in clinics that were saving lives with equipment my donation had purchased. I learned what it meant to be rich in purpose, to go to sleep every night knowing the day had mattered. People in the village treated me differently once they learned about the donation, some with a new respect that felt uncomfortable, some with a distance like wealth had made me untouchable. But the children at the school didn't change. They still ran to hug me when I arrived each morning, still told me about their days while I served their lunch, still saw me as just Betty who gave them extra rice and remembered their names. In their eyes, I found my reflection as I wanted to be seen. Simple, kind, present, enough exactly as I was. I met Thomas at the hospital opening, 6 months after the donation. He was a doctor who had left a comfortable position in the city to work in rural medicine, treating patients who had nothing to pay him except gratitude. We talked for hours about why we had made the choices we made, about what it meant to live with purpose, about the strange way suffering can crack you open and let light in. He didn't care about my money. He cared about my heart, my mind, the way I laughed at his terrible jokes. We started slowly, carefully, two people who had both been hurt learning to trust again. Our relationship grew like my grandmother's garden, patiently and with care. Thomas never tried to change me or make me into someone else. He loved the woman who lived in a small house and worked at a school and wore simple dresses from the market. He loved my history and my scars and my hard-won strength. When he asked me to marry him, a year after we met, he did it in my grandmother's garden with no ring and no ceremony, just a quiet question and my tearful yes. We married in the village with the school children as our witnesses, a simple ceremony that cost almost nothing and meant everything. No expensive hotel ballroom, no performance of perfection, just two people promising to love each other honestly, to build a life of meaning together, to keep each other's hearts safe. I wore a dress my grandmother had made years ago that I found in her closet, white cotton with small flowers embroidered by her hands. I felt her presence so strongly that day, felt her blessing on this new beginning. Paul sent a gift, an expensive vase that felt like an apology or maybe a goodbye. I donated it to a charity auction and used the money to buy school supplies for the children. His mother sent nothing, her silence saying everything about her character. I heard later that Paul and his wife had divorced, that he had lost his position at his father's firm due to some scandal I didn't care enough to follow. I felt sorry for him in an abstract way, the way you feel sorry for anyone who builds their life on sand and wonders why it keeps collapsing. My life now is not the life I imagined when I was young and dreaming in my grandmother's house. It's smaller in some ways, quieter. I never became a famous artist. I never traveled the world or wore designer clothes or lived in a mansion. But it's also bigger than I ever dreamed possible. Bigger in the ways that count. I wake up next to a man who treasures me. I work with children who teach me daily about joy and resilience. I see hospitals with my grandmother's legacy carved into their foundations, literally and figuratively. I live with purpose and peace, and the deep satisfaction of knowing I chose correctly when it mattered most. The greatest lesson I learned through all of this is simple but profound. Your worth is not determined by who values you. It's determined by who you are when no one is watching, when there's no reward for kindness, when doing the right thing costs you everything. I was worthy when I was married to Paul and cleaning floors to help pay bills. I was worthy when I was divorced and broken and living in a tiny house. I was worthy before I knew about the inheritance and worthy after I gave it away. The money didn't make me valuable. It just revealed what was already true. If you're watching this and you're in the place I was, feeling small and worthless and invisible, I need you to hear me clearly. You are not the lies people tell about you. You are not the ways you've been diminished or dismissed or destroyed. You are the person you choose to be when everything is stripped away and all that's left is your character. That is your inheritance from everyone who loved you and believed in you. That is what no one can take from you. That is what will save you when everything else fails. My grandmother understood something that took me years to learn. That suffering is inevitable but bitterness is optional. That you can survive terrible things and still love fiercely. That the truest wealth is measured not in what you keep but in what you give. That living with dignity is its own reward, regardless of who notices or applauds. She lived those truths and passed them to me, and now I'm passing them to my children when they come, to the students I teach, to anyone who needs to remember that they are enough exactly as they are. I still think about that moment sometimes, standing in Paul's ballroom, listening to him mock me in front of everyone. I think about how close I came to believing him, to accepting his version of my story, to living the rest of my life as the failure he declared me to be. And I think about my grandmother's letter arriving exactly when I needed it, about the inheritance of money, yes, but more importantly, the inheritance of example, of strength, of love that transcends death. That is what saved me, not the dollars. The belief one woman had in another, passed down like sacred fire, keeping me warm in the coldest night. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you for witnessing my truth. Thank you for sitting with me in the hard parts and celebrating the healing. Please leave a comment telling me what this brought up for you. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever had to choose between bitterness and grace? Are you in that place right now, trying to figure out who you are after someone tried to tell you who you weren't? I want to hear from you. Your story matters too. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the stories I'll keep sharing. Stories about real people surviving real heartbreak and finding real hope on the other side. Share this video with someone who needs to remember they're enough, who needs to hear that their worth isn't up for debate, who needs permission to walk away from people who make them feel small. Like this video, if it touched something in you, if it made you feel less alone, if it gave you hope. And remember this, you are someone's grandmother, not literally maybe, but spiritually. You are someone's example. Someone is watching how you handle heartbreak, how you respond to cruelty, how you choose to live when life is hard. What inheritance will you leave them? What story will they tell about your strength? Make it a good one, make it true. Make it worthy of the person you're becoming despite everything that tried to break you. You're still here. That means you're winning. Keep going. I'm proud of you. My grandmother would be proud of you. You're doing better than you think.